The 2016 film Arrival has gone down as one of the best science fiction films of recent years, garnering a ton of awards and nominations and receiving rave reviews from critics. It's a movie that affected me deeply when I first watched it, and I was surprised to discover a few years later that it's actually based on a short story. The way Arrival adapts its source material is a really interesting study into what makes a book-to-movie adaptation work, and it flies in the face of what people usually assume makes a good adaptation. My name is Ellie Blackwood. I'm a fantasy and sci-fi writer in progress, and today we're going to explore what actually makes a good film based on a book. And it probably isn't what you think. Arrival is based on the 1998 short story Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, and if I thought I liked the movie, I was blown away by the story. I read a lot of short science fiction, and this is still my favorite sci-fi short story ever. But Story of Your Life and Arrival break a common line of thinking about good book-to-movie adaptations. That is, the idea that a film adaptation is good when it sticks closely to its source material. Arrival tells a very different story to Story of Your Life, but it works brilliantly on screen. I'm also excited to discuss this with all of you, so be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments about what makes a good book-to-movie adaptation, even if you don't end up agreeing with me. If you like video essays about books, science fiction, Doctor Who, and all that goodness, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Also, be sure to subscribe to my monthly newsletter at the link in the description to get access to all of my YouTube videos 3 days before anyone else, and to keep up with all of my latest projects and content. Now let's get into it. In order to understand what makes Arrival work so well as a film adaptation, we must first understand why the short story works so well in its original format. Ted Chiang was inspired to write Story of Your Life after watching a performance of Paul Link's Time Flies When You're Alive, a one-man show about Link's relationship with his wife, who passed away from breast cancer. Story of Your Life was originally published in the second volume of Tor Books' Starlight Anthology series in 1998, and then in Chiang's own 2002 short story collection, Stories of Your Life and Others. Chiang had always been interested in the variational principles of physics, but upon watching Link's play, he wrote in the story notes of his collection, it occurred to me then that I might be able to use variational principles to tell a story about a person's response to the inevitable. The plot of Story of Your Life goes as follows. After aliens arrive in orbit around Earth and send some looking glasses down to the surface to essentially Skype with the humans, a linguist named Louise Banks is recruited to translate their language so that humans can talk to the aliens. As she communicates with the aliens, which the humans decide to refer to as heptapods, Louise begins learning their written language, which comes in the form of these sprawling diagrams. And the weird thing about them is, when the heptapods write, they seem to know exactly where their sentence is going before they even start. One of Louise's fellow researchers is a physicist, Gary Donnelly, whose job is to find out how the heptapods view math and physics. Through his own research, Gary realizes that the heptapods have trouble with a lot of our basic physics concepts, but they understand problems involving advanced calculus very easily. Specifically, they find it difficult to understand problems that rely on cause and effect, but they find it super easy to understand problems that involve integration over time. All this goes to show that heptapods don't view time in a linear cause and effect manner like humans do. Instead, they're always aware of where the future is going and what must be done to get there. The humans never find out why the heptapods came, or indeed why they leave at the end of the story, though presumably there's some bigger reason for it. But as she gets deeper into her task of translating the language, Louise begins to experience time in the same non-linear way that the heptapods do. The first indication that Louise doesn't exactly have a conventional view of time is that the story itself is non-linear, and there are sections written in different tenses. The main plot of the story is about Louise studying the aliens, written in past tense. But there are also several sections written in the future tense, with anecdotes about her future daughter, whom Louise somehow knows already. This includes, relatively early in the story, Louise's knowledge that her daughter will die at the age of 25 in a rock climbing accident. We find out later in the story that Gary the physicist is the father of her child. Louise addresses her child in the second person, hence the title Story of Your Life. While the different tenses make it clear whether Louise is narrating the past, present, or future, the way they blend can feel a little trippy. For example, Louise begins one section by narrating, "I remember one afternoon when you are 5 years old after you have come home from kindergarten. You'll be coloring with your crayons while I grade papers. Obviously, you can't remember something that hasn't happened yet, but these kinds of blended tenses are all over the story. And it's only as the story unfolds and Louise delves deeper into the alien's language that the reader understands why she is telling the story this way. The question that the story lands on is, if you already know your future, what happens to your free will? After all, if Louise knows exactly when and how her daughter is going to die, surely she would tell her not to go rock climbing. Well, after Louise starts experiencing her whole timeline at once, she kind of loses her sense of free will. As the story explains, what if the experience of knowing the future changed a person? What if it evoked a sense of urgency, a sense of obligation to act precisely as she knew she would? At one point in the past timeline, Louise and Gary are going shopping, and she comes across a salad bowl that she knows will, in the future, fall off a shelf and hit her daughter on the head. Louise doesn't hesitate in buying the bowl, even though she knows it will hurt her daughter several years down the line, because she knows that's simply what's supposed to happen. This is a mini reenactment of why Louise didn't warn her daughter about her death ahead of time. Louise explains, "Knowledge of the future was incompatible with free will. What made it possible for me to exercise freedom of choice also made it impossible for me to know the future. Conversely, now that I know the future, I would never act contrary to that future, including telling others what I know." Louise still has a sense of a linear timeline because she's still human, but the way she approaches that timeline is profoundly different to how she did before. The only event in present tense, the scene where the story starts and ends, is when Gary asks Louise if she wants to have a baby with him, and Louise says yes. When Louise makes this decision, she knows exactly where the journey of motherhood will take her. Except it's not really a decision in the way that she used to make decisions before she learned the heptapod language. As she explains, freedom isn't an illusion, it's perfectly real in the context of sequential consciousness. Within the context of simultaneous consciousness, freedom is not meaningful, but neither is coercion. It's simply a different context, no more or less valid than the other. This doesn't mean that Louise doesn't feel joy or pain or all the other emotions that come from loving a child and having them ripped away from you. It's just that she knows all these emotions are necessary, that this is the way things are meant to be. This story and all its complex weirdness captured the hearts of readers everywhere, including a certain screenwriter. So now we have to ask, how did this weird cerebral short story become a Hollywood blockbuster? Story of Your Life was always going to be tricky to adapt to screen. In the first instance, it's full of nerdy info dumps about language and physics and philosophy. And in the second instance, nonlinear storytelling is always a challenge. But screenwriter Eric Heiserer was willing to give it a try. In addition to Arrival, Heiserer is known for his work writing the movie Bird Box and for being the showrunner of the Shadow and Bone TV show, both with Netflix. Both of these properties were actually based on books, so this seems to be a common theme with Heiserer's body of work. Because Heiserer was the driving force in getting Story of Your Life adapted for screen and was heavily involved with the production process, Arrival is perhaps one of the best possible case studies for studying a challenging book-to-screen adaptation, largely because Heiserer has been interviewed at length about why the film ended up the way that it did. Heiserer got into Ted Chiang's writing when a friend recommended that he read a different story of Chiang's called Understand, which, by the way, is also very good. After reading and loving Understand, Heiserer picked up Chiang's full collection, Stories of Your Life and Others, and was absolutely wrecked when he got to Story of Your Life. And after he'd finished reeling, he thought, quote, "How can I torture a greater audience with this?" So after multiple years of trying to convince studios to make the project, he finally succeeded in getting the film greenlit, with Denis Villeneuve attached to direct. Any film adaptation of a book diverges at least somewhat from the original story, and Heiserer wasn't afraid to make bold changes for his script. In an interview with Science vs. Cinema, Heiserer explained, "My prime directive was to take the way the short story made me feel and gently lift that from the source material and find a way to transplant that into a film. Therefore, as long as the emotional core of the story was intact, he could get away with some pretty big narrative changes." The first big change Heiserer made from the short story, and the one which many of the other changes derive from, is to have the heptapods descend to Earth rather than Skyping. This made the aliens more concrete and real, and dialed up the conflict because it made the public panic more about about their presence. And that in turn led to more political conflict among the countries of the world as they tried to navigate this unfamiliar situation within their existing tensions. The story ends up becoming more of a political thriller in that regard. Another consequence of making the aliens come to Earth is that there is more opportunity for sweeping, awe-inspiring cinematography. In particular, Denis Villeneuve insisted on the approach into the ship being more otherworldly and dramatic, leading to the iconic scene where the crew enters the heptapod ship and the gravity shifts. In the short story, Louise refers to the two heptapods she's working with as Flapper and Raspberry, but Heiserer renamed them Abbott and Costello as an homage to the classic Abbott and Costello Who's On First skit about miscommunication. Obviously, because it's a movie, the long narrative musings from the short story are almost entirely gone in the film, even though a lot of extra exposition was filmed. This included some deleted scenes where the movie's version of Gary, who has been renamed Ian, explains how the heptapods view physics. However, the final movie pretty much sticks entirely to language rather than science. The emotional core of the film still revolves around Louise and her daughter, with scenes of their relationship scattered throughout the film. Instead of dying at the age of 25 in a rock climbing accident, Louise's daughter dies at the age of 12 from a rare disease. This was partly done so they wouldn't have to age up Louise's actress and give the twist away that these scenes are from her future, but it was also done because of the way the film shifts the theme of free will from the book. For all his love of the short story, Heiserer kind of rejects Chiang's framing of free will from Story of Your Life. Instead of making it so that Louise has basically no agency over what happens, he wanted to make it into a story about her knowing what would happen and choosing to do it anyway. Obviously, if you knew someone was going to die in a rock climbing accident, you could just tell them not to go. But her daughter dying of a disease is something Louise could only prevent by choosing not to have her daughter at all, and that's a much different situation. Now let's talk about how the finished movie works as a story to really unpack how those themes play out on screen. Once Heiserer had solved all these challenges, the film Arrival was complete. So what kind of story does Arrival deliver? Well, Arrival in many ways answers way more questions than the short story does. In the story, it's left unexplained why the heptapods came or what they want. In the movie, the heptapods directly tell Louise that they're here because they know that in 3,000 years, they'll need help from the humans. So in preparation for that, they wanted to come and give humans a gift, the gift of their language, and therefore their gift of being able to see the future. But for most of the movie, the heptapods' motivations are unknown, and that obviously means the humans are skeptical. The film has a layer of fear of the unknown and paranoia about those who aren't like us. The US military apparatus handling the communication with the heptapods is not only suspicious of the aliens, but also suspicious of other countries' motivations. The 12 heptapod landing sites worldwide have teams of humans from their respective countries interfacing with the aliens, and while the teams at first try to cooperate and share knowledge, these relationships soon break down. In fact, the atmosphere of paranoia gets so heightened that at one point a rogue group of US soldiers go to try and blow up the heptapod spacecraft, and one of the heptapods dies because of it. When the US and China finally ask the heptapods why they came to Earth, they receive answers that shock them. The US translates the response as offer weapon, and China translates it as use weapon. This causes General Chiang of China to cut off contact with the rest of the world and threaten to attack the heptapods if they don't leave, and several other countries follow suit. But in the end, the humans' paranoia is unfounded. The aliens are truly just there to provide a gift to the humans, and they weren't saying weapon, but rather tool. As far as the countries' relationship with each other, it turns out that the US's perception of the other countries as irrational warmongers is false, and General Chiang is shown to be a very nice man once he and Louise establish a sense of trust. In an interview with Fresh Fiction, Heiserer explained, "I wanted to talk about how ridiculously important it is to establish clear lines of communication with each other. We're at a time when our interconnectedness is greater than at any other time in human history, and we are fumbling left and right with our ability just to be able to talk to each other, not just internationally, but to our neighbors." As I alluded to earlier, the way the story plays with time is presented as more of a twist in the film than it is in the short story. We get scenes of Louise interacting with her daughter throughout, and indeed the film opens with a monologue montage that shows the daughter died young of a disease. The daughter isn't named in the story, but in the film she's named Hannah because it's a palindrome that reflects the heptapod's worldview. As viewers, we are trained to assume that movies are shown to us in chronological sequence. On the first watch of Arrival, most viewers would assume that Louise had a child who died before the aliens came. Throughout the film, as Louise learns more of the heptapod's language, we get more flashes of Louise remembering times with Hannah. She looks troubled whenever this happens, because she doesn't recognize Hannah and doesn't really know what's happening to her mind. But as a viewer, it's easy to interpret the expression on her face as sadness that her daughter died. The movie doesn't tie itself in too many knots to avoid revealing the twist early, but a few subtle choices help keep the illusion intact. For example, about halfway through the film, there's a montage explaining what the researchers know about the heptapods and what they've discovered about how the heptapod language works. The voiceover monologue during this montage is delivered not by Louise, but by Ian, even though Ian isn't a linguist. One can only speculate about why the filmmakers made that choice. At the very least, Eric Heiserer didn't explain it in any of the interviews I watched while researching for this video. But if Louise had delivered the monologue, it would have required her revealing more about her experience of learning the heptapod language, which risks uncovering the twist too early. The way that the future bleeds into Louise's present comes to a head at the end of the movie, where she saves the day based on her knowledge of the future. As the threat of China attacking the heptapod ships intensifies, Louise remembers a future encounter with General Chiang at a UN event. The general says that they avoided descending into a world war because she called him on his private number and told him his wife's dying words. So in the present, Louise does just that, causing the general to open the lines of communication again and start collaborating with the rest of the world in assembling the information they received from the heptapods. This is, of course, a classic bootstrap paradox, where Louise gains information from the future that she only knew because she did something in the present. But she couldn't do the thing in the present without the information from the future. I hesitate to call a bootstrap paradox a cheap trick because I do love me a bootstrap paradox, but I think it's a trope that tends to fit better in the realm of a sci-fi thriller movie than in a cerebral literary short story. In an interview with Jeff Goldsmith, Heiserer described the climactic sequence as a little trophy for Doctor Who fans, which I very much appreciate. But this resolution also provides a natural way for Louise's new way of seeing time to intersect with the main plot. It seems appropriate for a feature film where viewers expect a more traditional series of story beats than they might in a piece of short fiction. Unlike with the short story, Arrival makes it seem perfectly logical for Louise to make all the choices she does with her knowledge of the future. There's no scene akin to the one in the short story where Louise buys a salad bowl that she knows will later hurt her daughter or anything like that. And it makes total sense that Louise would choose to have Hannah even though she knows she'll end up dying. In her memory, Louise has already read every one of Hannah's poems, watched all her swimming competitions, played every game with her, bandaged every one of her cuts, seen every one of her smiles. With all those memories, knowing just how much Hannah touched the world in the short time she was alive, how could she make the decision not to have Hannah? Another change the movie makes is explaining why Louise and Ian split up in the future. In the story, it's not explained why Louise and Gary got a divorce, but in the movie, it's because Louise eventually tells Ian that she knows their daughter will die, and he doesn't take it well. Ian's perspective is that Louise made the wrong choice in deciding to have Hannah even though she knew she was going to die, and as harsh as that sounds, I can kind of see where he's coming from. After all, if I was asked to decide whether or not I wanted to have a kid who would die young of a rare disease, I would probably say no. But that's because the kid would be a hypothetical to me. When Louise makes the decision to have Hannah, she already knows her and loves her. Louise has also had time to come to terms with and accept Hannah's death, whereas Ian didn't have the luxury of that. It kind of sucks that Ian's behavior makes Hannah feel unloved by her dad, and maybe he should have made more of an effort to treat her the same as before. But I also can't really blame him for acting weird while he preemptively grieves his daughter. Overall, while Arrival is very different in some ways to the short story, it absolutely achieves the goal that Heiserer set out to accomplish. As much as you get a different experience from reading the story versus watching the movie, both pieces of media leave you with a profound emotional experience, reflecting on love and loss and how our lives can be wonderful even if they come with tragedy. And that, I think, is the true test of a good adaptation. Does Arrival really count as an adaptation of Story of Your Life if the end result is so different in terms of theme and approach? To me, the answer is yeah. As fans, we often think of film adaptations as a way to see our favorite stories come to life. And I can't deny that it is super fun to see your favorite character embodied perfectly by an actor, or to hear dialogue that you loved spoken out loud. But I think treating a film adaptation as nothing more than a story coming to life is kind of a flattening of what film adaptations can achieve. You can't faithfully adapt Story of Your Life for film because Story of Your Life only works as a short story. That's why Ted Chiang wrote it as a short story and not as a novel or a comic strip or a radio play. So I think the best film adaptations are actually the ones that look at what the book achieved, take inspiration from the concept and themes and vibes, and present a brand new story for the medium of film. It doesn't matter whether the film accomplishes the exact same things as the story, just so long as the film accomplishes something good. But that's just my opinion, so be sure to sound off in the comments about whether you agree with my take or not. I'd also love to know which book to film adaptations you love and why you think they work so well. If you want to make sure you don't miss my upcoming video essays, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And also remember to subscribe to my monthly newsletter at the link in the description to get access to all of my YouTube videos before anyone else. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.